In December 1991, a red flag was lowered over the Kremlin for the last time, and 286 million people went to sleep as Soviet citizens and woke up as strangers in newly foreign countries. Mikhail Gorbachev, the last general secretary of a superpower that had endured for 69 years, signed the dissolution documents in a near-empty office, while outside, Moscow streets sat quiet under a heavy winter frost, as if the city itself could not yet comprehend what had happened. So why, more than 3 decades later, do polling agencies consistently find that a majority of Russians and significant minorities across former Soviet republics say they regret the collapse? And what exactly is it they are mourning? The numbers are striking. In 2018, the Levada Center, Russia's most respected independent polling organization, found that 66% of Russians expressed regret over the Soviet Union's dissolution, the highest figure since the question was first asked, in the early 2000s. Even among respondents aged 25 to 39, people who barely remember the USSR or never lived in it at all, roughly half expressed some form of nostalgia. These are not marginal sentiments confined to elderly pensioners clutching faded party cards. They represent a broad cross-generational phenomenon that cuts across education levels, income brackets, and even political affiliations. And the reasons behind these numbers are far more complex and far more human than Western observers typically assume. To understand this nostalgia, you have to understand what the Soviet system actually provided at street level, not in its propaganda posters, but in the daily tangible architecture of ordinary life. Consider a factory worker in Sverdlovsk in 1975. His name might have been Victor. He earned a modest salary, perhaps 180 rubles a month, which by Western standards was low, but his rent was fixed by the state at roughly 5% of his income. His children attended school for free. Medical care, from a routine checkup to major surgery, cost him nothing out of pocket. His factory provided a subsidized canteen where lunch cost kopecks. Every summer, his family received vouchers to a sanatorium on the Black Sea coast, a 2-week vacation at a seaside resort, paid for almost entirely by the state or his trade union. When he retired, his pension was guaranteed. He did not worry about homelessness. He did not worry about unemployment. He did not worry about his children's university tuition. The system extracted enormous costs in other ways: political freedom, consumer choice, the ability to travel, the right to speak openly, but for tens of millions of people, it delivered a baseline of material security that felt, in the moment, like solid ground beneath their feet. And when that ground vanished almost overnight, what replaced it was not freedom as most people experienced it. What replaced it was freefall. If this kind of history, the real ground-level mechanics of how the Soviet system functioned and why its collapse left such deep scars, is something you want to understand more deeply, consider subscribing to this channel. We are building a community of people who believe that the 20th century's most consequential events deserve more than surface-level takes, and every subscription helps us continue doing exactly that. Now, the collapse did not arrive without warning, but it arrived with a speed that still astonishes historians. Through the 1980s, the Soviet economy was stagnating. Oil prices, which had propped up the Brezhnev-era illusion of prosperity, cratered in 1986. Gorbachev's reforms, glasnost, and perestroika were designed to modernize the system, not destroy it. But they unleashed forces that no one in the Kremlin fully anticipated. Glasnost opened the door to public criticism, and once that door was open, decades of suppressed grievances came flooding through. Perestroika attempted to introduce market mechanisms into a command economy, but without clear rules or institutions, it created chaos rather than efficiency. Cooperative enterprises emerged in a legal gray zone. State factories lost guaranteed supply chains. Shelves that had always been modestly stocked began to empty. By 1989 and 1990, Soviet citizens were standing in lines not for luxury goods but for bread, sugar, and soap. The social contract, you accept political restrictions and we guarantee your security, was breaking down on both sides simultaneously. What happened next is crucial for understanding the nostalgia because it shapes everything that followed. The dissolution of the Soviet Union was not primarily a popular revolution from below. Surveys taken in March 1991, just 9 months before the collapse, showed that in a nationwide referendum, over 77% of Soviet citizens who participated voted to preserve the Union in some reformed capacity. More than 113 million people cast ballots saying yes, they wanted the USSR to continue. That vote is often forgotten in Western narratives, which tend to frame the collapse as an inevitable triumph of freedom over tyranny. But for the majority of the population, the end of the Soviet Union was something that happened to them, not something they chose. It was driven by elite political maneuvering, Yeltsin's rivalry with Gorbachev, the August 1991 coup attempt by hardliners that backfired spectacularly, the Belavezor Accords signed in a hunting lodge in the Belarusian forest by the leaders of Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus, effectively dissolving the Union over the heads of its citizens. 3 men in a forest lodge ended a superpower, and the people who had voted to keep it were never consulted again. What followed in the 1990s is the single most important chapter in understanding Soviet nostalgia, because it is not the Soviet era itself that most people are romanticizing, it is the contrast with what came after. The decade that Russians simply call the 90s was, by virtually every measurable indicator, a catastrophe for ordinary people on a scale rarely seen outside of wartime. Under the shock therapy economic reforms championed by Yegor Gaidar and backed by Western advisors like Jeffrey Sachs, the Russian government lifted price controls in January 1992. Inflation exploded. In 1992 alone, prices rose by approximately 2,500%. A lifetime of savings, the money Victor the factory worker had set aside in his state savings account, became worthless in weeks. Imagine spending 30 years carefully accumulating 10,000 rubles, enough to buy a car, and then discovering that your entire savings could now purchase a few bags of groceries. This was not an abstraction. It happened to nearly every family in the country simultaneously. The privatization process that followed was even more devastating to public trust. State assets, oil companies, metals combines, telecommunications networks, entire industries built by decades of collective labor were sold off at absurdly low prices, often to politically connected insiders. The loans for shares scheme of 1995 and 1996 was particularly brazen. A handful of bankers who would become known as the oligarchs acquired controlling stakes in some of the world's most resource-rich companies for fractions of their actual value. Mikhail Khodorkovsky acquired Yukos, one of Russia's largest oil companies, for approximately $310 million. Within a few years, it was valued at tens of billions. Boris Berezovsky, Vladimir Potanin, Roman Abramovich, names that would become synonymous with grotesque wealth, built their fortunes not through innovation or entrepreneurship, but through proximity to power and the exploitation of a system in freefall. Meanwhile, teachers went months without pay. Soldiers sold their equipment to feed their families. Pensioners stood in freezing streets selling their possessions, a pair of shoes, a set of dishes, a winter coat, because their pensions, if they arrived at all, could no longer cover food. Here is a statistic that rarely appears in Western discussions of the Soviet collapse, but that is seared into the collective memory of the former Soviet population. Between 1991 and 1994, male life expectancy in Russia dropped from 63.5 years to 57.4 years. That is a decline of more than 6 years, in roughly 3 years of calendar time. To put that in perspective, demographers struggle to find a peacetime parallel anywhere in the modern industrialized world. The causes were multiple and reinforcing. Alcoholism surged as despair deepened. The healthcare system, stripped of funding, deteriorated rapidly. Violent crime exploded as the state's ability to enforce law collapsed. Suicide rates spiked. Russia in the 1990s experienced what some scholars have called a mortality crisis, excess deaths numbering in the millions, driven not by a single catastrophic event, but by the slow disintegration of the systems that had kept people alive. When Russians say they miss the Soviet Union, many of them are really saying, "We did not die at 57." The psychological dimensions of this loss are just as important as the material ones, and they are harder to quantify but no less real. The Soviet Union, for all its repressions and failures, provided its citizens with something that market capitalism in its rawest form does not automatically supply: a sense of collective purpose and social belonging. Soviet identity was not merely national, it was civilizational. Citizens were told, and many genuinely believed, that they were building a new kind of society, one that would eventually surpass the West in justice, equality, and human development. The first satellite in space was Soviet. The first human in orbit, Yuri Gagarin, a carpenter's son from Smolensk, was Soviet. The army that broke the Wehrmacht at Stalingrad and raised the red banner over the Reichstag was Soviet. These were not just propaganda points, they were sources of authentic pride for hundreds of millions of people. When the Union dissolved, that narrative of purpose dissolved with it. The message that replaced it, delivered implicitly by the triumphal tone of Western commentary, was stark. Everything you built was a mistake. Everything you believed was a lie, and the proof is that you lost. For people who had spent their entire adult lives within the Soviet framework, this was not merely a political transition. It was an existential crisis. Teachers who had taught Marxist-Leninist philosophy found their expertise worthless overnight. Military officers who had commanded respect discovered that society now valued only wealth. Engineers who had designed spacecraft were selling cigarettes at kiosks. The Russian word for this experience, unizhenia, humiliation, appears constantly in interviews and memoirs from the period. And it is a word that carries enormous emotional weight in Russian culture. The 1990s were experienced by a vast portion of the population, not as liberation, but as humiliation. And the nostalgia for the Soviet era is, in many cases, a refusal to accept that humiliation as the final word. But it would be a mistake to reduce Soviet nostalgia to mere reaction against the 90s, because the phenomenon has layers that go deeper than economics or wounded pride. There is a genuine and widespread mourning for a way of life that, despite its many absurdities and cruelties, had its own internal logic and its own forms of human warmth. The Soviet communal apartment, the kommunalka, was cramped, lacking in privacy, and often a source of petty conflicts. But it was also a place where neighbors knew each other's names, shared kitchens, watched each other's children, and formed bonds that many survivors describe with surprising tenderness. The Soviet workplace was inefficient by Western standards, overstaffed and plagued by bureaucratic absurdities. But it was also a social world, a place where colleagues celebrated holidays together, organized amateur theater troupes, and provided a sense of daily structure and community. The Soviet pioneer camp, where children spent summers swimming, hiking, and singing around campfires, is remembered by many with an intensity of affection that mirrors the way Americans recall idealized childhoods that may or may not have existed as remembered. Memory is selective. Nostalgia is not history. But the emotions are real, and they shape political behavior in ways that have enormous consequences. There is another dimension that is often overlooked in Western analyses, and it concerns geopolitics and national standing. The Soviet Union was one of two superpowers. Its voice carried weight in every international forum. Its military was feared. Its scientific achievements were genuine. Its space program was, for a crucial period, ahead of America's. For citizens of the USSR, this mattered. It mattered in the same way that American global dominance matters to Americans. Not because ordinary people derive direct material benefit from having nuclear submarines patrolling the ocean, but because being a citizen of a powerful country provides a psychological infrastructure of significance. After 1991, Russia went from superpower to supplicant. Western advisors arrived to restructure the economy. NATO, which had been the Soviet Union's primary adversary, expanded eastward, incorporating countries that had been Soviet allies or even Soviet republics. The message, as perceived from Moscow, was not that Russia had joined the community of nations as an equal partner. The message was that Russia had lost, and the victors were now rearranging the furniture. This perception, whether fair or distorted, fuels nostalgia for an era when Russia was unquestionably powerful, when no one dared to disregard its interests, when the country sat at one end of a global axis around which the entire world revolved. It is worth pausing here to acknowledge a paradox that sits at the heart of this phenomenon, because it reveals something important about how human memory works. The Soviet Union was, by any honest accounting, a system that inflicted enormous suffering on its own people. The Gulag system, documented meticulously by Alexander Solzhenitsyn and later by historians like Anne Applebaum, imprisoned and killed millions. The forced collectivization of agriculture under Stalin caused a famine in Ukraine, the Holodomor, that killed an estimated 3.5 to 5 million people between 1932 and 1933. The Great Purge of 1937 and 1938 saw approximately 750,000 executions and over 1 million additional arrests. Political dissidents were confined to psychiatric hospitals. Entire ethnic groups, Chechens, Crimean Tatars, Volga Germans, were deported en masse to Central Asia and Siberia under conditions that killed tens of thousands. The Soviet system was capable of breathtaking cruelty, and any honest reckoning with its legacy must hold that truth in plain view. So how do millions of people look back on this system with longing? The answer lies partly in periodization. When most Russians express nostalgia for the Soviet Union, they are typically not nostalgic for the Stalin era, though a troubling minority are. They are nostalgic for the Brezhnev era, the long stretch from the mid-1960s to the early 1980s that Soviet-era jokes dubbed the era of stagnation, but that many ordinary people experienced as the most stable and predictable period of their lives. Under Brezhnev, the terror had receded. You were unlikely to be arrested for a careless remark at a dinner party, as you might have been under Stalin. Consumer goods were limited but available. Housing construction boomed. The prefabricated apartment blocks known as Khrushchevki and Brezhnevki, ugly by any architectural standard, nevertheless gave millions of families their first private apartments after decades of communal living. Wages were low, but prices were lower. The system was stagnant, yes, but stagnation felt to many like stability. And stability for people whose grandparents had survived revolution, civil war, famine, world war, and political terror was not a small thing. It was everything. The answer also lies in what psychologists call rosy retrospection, the well-documented tendency of human memory to soften the negative and amplify the positive when looking back over time. This is not unique to Russians or to the Soviet experience. Americans are nostalgic for the 1950s despite segregation. Britons are nostalgic for the post-war welfare state despite rationing. Nostalgia is a universal human phenomenon, a way of constructing a usable past that provides comfort in an uncertain present. But in Russia, this universal tendency is amplified by the extraordinary severity of the contrast between the Soviet era and the decade that followed it. If the 90s had been a period of gradually increasing prosperity and expanding freedom, if the transition had looked like Poland's or the Czech Republic's, painful but ultimately successful, Soviet nostalgia would likely be a marginal phenomenon. It is the depth of the post-Soviet catastrophe that makes the preceding era glow in memory, the same way a mediocre meal tastes magnificent to someone who has been starving. There is also a deliberate, state-driven component to this nostalgia that cannot be ignored. Under Vladimir Putin, who came to power in 1999 and has dominated Russian politics ever since, the Soviet past has been selectively rehabilitated. Putin famously called the collapse of the Soviet Union the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century, a statement that was widely misquoted in the West as an endorsement of the Soviet system, but that, read in context, was primarily a statement about the human consequences of the collapse. The displacement of 25 million ethnic Russians who suddenly found themselves minorities in newly independent states, the economic devastation, the loss of national coherence. Under Putin's leadership, the Soviet victory in World War II, the Great Patriotic War, has been elevated to the central event of Russian national identity, commemorated with ever larger Victory Day parades, ever more stringent laws against falsifying history, and an emotional intensity that serves both genuine memory and political purpose. The Soviet anthem's melody was restored as the Russian national anthem in 2000, with new lyrics. Soviet-era films, many of them genuinely excellent, are replayed endlessly on state television. The message is carefully calibrated. The Soviet era had glories worth remembering. The collapse was a tragedy, and the current leadership represents recovery and restoration. This narrative does not create nostalgia from nothing, but it amplifies, channels, and instrumentalizes sentiments that already exist. Yet to attribute Soviet nostalgia entirely to state propaganda would be patronizing and inaccurate. Talk to ordinary Russians in provincial cities like Penza, Voronezh, or Omsk, places far from Moscow's relative prosperity, and you will hear stories that no amount of propaganda could manufacture. You will hear a retired schoolteacher describe how she once had a guaranteed apartment, a predictable salary, and the knowledge that her students would have jobs waiting for them after graduation, and how all of that vanished. You will hear a former engineer describe the humiliation of watching his factory, a factory where he had worked for 25 years, where his father had worked before him, sold to a businessman from Moscow who stripped it for parts and fired everyone. You will hear a grandmother describe how her grandson cannot afford medical treatment that would have been provided free of charge under the old system. These are not ideological statements. They are testimonies of lived experience, and they carry the weight of authenticity that no amount of Western commentary can easily dismiss. The phenomenon extends beyond Russia's borders. In surveys conducted across former Soviet states and Eastern Bloc countries, significant minorities, and in some cases majorities, express nostalgia for the communist era. A 2009 Pew Research Center survey found that 72% of Hungarians said most people were worse off after the transition to capitalism. In Ukraine, before the current conflict reshaped political attitudes, substantial portions of the Eastern population expressed Soviet nostalgia. In the former East Germany, the phenomenon of ostalgie, a portmanteau of Ost, East and nostalgia, became so pervasive that it spawned its own consumer industry, with shops selling replicas of East German products, restaurants serving East German recipes, and films like Goodbye Lenin, exploring the emotional complexity of the experience with both humor and genuine pathos. Even in the Baltic states, which suffered Soviet occupation most acutely and whose independence movements were among the most determined, there exist Russian-speaking minority populations for whom the Soviet collapse meant a loss of status and security that still stings. What makes this nostalgia politically significant is that it is not merely backward-looking. It shapes present-day attitudes toward democracy, capitalism, and the West in ways that have profound geopolitical consequences. When Western leaders express bewilderment at Russian public support for authoritarian governance, or at skepticism toward free market economics, or at hostility toward NATO expansion, they are often failing to account for the formative experience of the 1990s, a decade in which democracy was associated with poverty, capitalism was associated with theft, and Western advice was associated with national humiliation. The 1990s did not just impoverish Russia, they discredited an entire set of ideas in the minds of tens of millions of people. And the nostalgia for the Soviet era is, in many ways, the emotional residue of that discrediting. There is one more element that deserves attention, and it is perhaps the most universal of all. The Soviet Union provided something that modern market societies struggle to provide: a coherent answer to the question of meaning. Why do you work? For the construction of socialism. Why do you sacrifice? For future generations. Why does your country matter? Because it is building a new world. These answers were often hollow, often contradicted by reality, often enforced through coercion rather than conviction, but they existed, they were available. They were woven into every school curriculum, every workplace meeting, every holiday celebration, every film and novel and song. After the collapse, what replaced them? The logic of the market, which tells you that you work for yourself, that your value is determined by your purchasing power, and that the meaning of your life is a private matter with which the state has no concern. For some people, this was liberating. For many others, it was a void. The Soviet nostalgia phenomenon ultimately teaches us something not only about Russia, but about the human relationship with security, identity, and historical memory. People do not evaluate political systems in the abstract. They evaluate them against lived experience, against the alternatives they have actually encountered, against the specific texture of their own biographies. A system that provided cradle-to-grave security at the cost of political freedom will be remembered fondly by those who valued security and paid the costs of freedom's absence in the specific currency of the 1990s: poverty, chaos, humiliation, and premature death. This does not make the Soviet Union a good system. It does not justify its crimes. It does not invalidate the millions who fought for its end. But it does explain why, on cold evenings in apartment blocks across the former Soviet space, elderly men and women still watch old Soviet films on flickering televisions, still hum melodies from Soviet-era songs, and still tell their grandchildren that once, despite everything, there was a country where no one was afraid of tomorrow. Whether that country ever truly existed as they remember it is almost beside the point. The longing is real, the loss is real, and the consequences of that loss continue to shape the world we live in now.